What up with you folks? Thank you for tuning in. Today we are drawing an electric motorcycle of sorts. It's a continuation of the previous couple of videos. Link in the description to those below. Let's get into it. So I'm starting this sketch off with a C0 or Copic Cool Gray 0. It's the lightest Copic in the range, and I'm using the chisel point to basically block things in. I'm working off of a side view, right? So I'd already sketched the side view, so I had an idea of what I was going for, or what I was looking for. So I wasn't completely unguided as far as where I was going with this sketch, but nonetheless, I started with a C0 to block it in and test my proportions, make sure things were looking and feeling right before committing to some of the darker markers, or I end up coming in here later with a Prismacolor. So I really wanted to give myself a solid foundation to then sketch over with some of the more, I'll say, indelible markers in the range. And it's an electric motor, and I'm thinking that there's this kind of cylindrical cooling and battery and ECU compartment, all these kind of electronics encased in this unit that's tucked fairly low. That may not be the most efficient way to do it, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about this. And then stacking the battery pack above that cylindrical unit. And this front fairing, a little bit different in the sense that it comes up over your triple clamps, and you've got clip-on bars or clip-on grips with this fairing piece that runs from the tank over that triple clamp and forms this kind of snout up front that's all illuminated, right? So edge lighting up front with maybe a nice LED in the center or something like that. And again, with the same C0 blocking in the triple clamps, I do think that the overall angle of the forks, at least at this point, is maybe a little too stood up, right? So I want to lean them back a little bit to get that thing feeling a little bit sporty. It feels a little like standing on its tippy toes in this weird way, a little too compressed at the front. Looks like it's hit something a little bit. So I'll work with that a bit later. And I continue to work through the forms. And I feel like there's this floating seat element with an empty, below the seat will be hollow, right? So you'll be able to see right through the bike, and maybe there's an optional storage mechanism or something underneath that seat. And then here I flip the sketch over and I'm looking at it to see, is the proportion right? What needs to be tweaked? It's always good to see your sketch in reverse, and things that you can't see when you're sketching it regular, I'll call it, come to light when you reverse the sketch. You can do this in Photoshop. Just hit Command T to transform and flip it horizontally, and that'll flip your sketch. It's the same idea, just I'm doing that here on paper. And I'm realizing that the forks are a little bit tucked, a little bit too, it's a bad angle, right? We already talked about that. It's a bad angle, so I'm gonna fix it a little bit anyway. But now I'm coming through with a Prismacolor, and in previous sketches I'd come through at a little bit later point in the sketch, but with a pen, and just made really clean marks with the pen, and that creates a particular style. Here, I'm going over the marker work with the Prismacolor. Again, the Prismacolors don't bleed in the same way that certain markers might. It can make things a little bit muddy if you put too thick of a layer of Prismacolor on, and then go back over that with marker, right? Because some of the sediment, I'll call it, from the Copic can then smear a little bit. But with this thin line work, it's not going to be an issue. So what you'll see is I'll go over this with the Prismacolor and get my line work in, and because it's not a pen, I can build up the line work a little bit and finesse it a little bit more and experiment and play more than you can with a pen, or especially those gel pens. So I'll do that, and here I'm working through this tank section, trying to figure out how some of these elements come together, and I'm working towards that rear section. And then this fairing kind of wraps around that swing arm in I think a fairly unique way. And yeah, my bike might be a little bit low. We might want to, in a later sketch, raise the bike, give it some more ground clearance. All right, we're thinking that this is an electric motorcycle, an urban motorcycle, kind of not really off-road, right? Because it's a motorcycle. You're in the city, right? So you're not really going off-road a whole lot. I guess it depends on what city you live in. But regardless, if you want a curb hop or something like that, we want to give you enough clearance for that. And right now, I think that there's maybe some room to raise this bike up a bit. But either way, looking for these lines here, kind of working through that tank section. It's kind of weird when there's no gas tank, right? It's like, what do you do with all this space when there's no real functional piece? All you need to do is provide the human body with a little bit of support. The rest of it, you can do whatever you want with. So for the moment, I'm just keeping it open, essentially. There's a little surface that wraps over the triple clamps, and then it's open underneath. But we are putting some cladding over where the battery packs might be. Okay, right, because the battery packs aren't the most elegant thing to look at. They're kind of just like bricks. Like if you've ever seen like an RC car battery, these little blue cubes, it's basically that, but lined up in series, and you got a bunch more of them. So there's a bunch of little cubes in there. It's like building bricks. Kind of tough to make that look super interesting. So for the moment, we're just going to put some cladding over it. So be it. Again, with the Prismacolor, it's nice because I can work through things. I went over, gave it a once over basically, and now I'm coming back in and starting to add some light shading. And again, I want to be cognizant of the fact that, or I am cognizant of the fact that if you put too much shading on at this point, it does start to look muddy when you come back in with markers. So I'm realizing that at this point and saying, okay, if I'm going to start shading, let's start with marker, right? So I grabbed the C2 or the Copic Cool Gray 2, and I'm starting to block in the surfaces that are facing away from the light or not turned directly towards the light. And I'm assuming the light is coming from kind of a top 3/4, right? So from the front and a little bit above the bike. So those top surfaces are going to be pretty light. They're going to be the lightest in the range. And then the side surfaces are going to be a little bit darker, right? Assuming that the light is actually turned more towards the side than it is the front, right? So those surfaces will be darker than the top surfaces, and then the front surfaces will be the darkest in the range. So again, coming in with the C2, blocking in as much as I can with this lighter color, because it's fairly, or lighter value, it's fairly forgiving, right? Unless I want a section to be white, I don't lose anything by going over it with the C2, right? Because I can always make it darker. Right, starting to add some of that C2 and setting some of those elements that are either completely turned away from the light or that are tucked behind that side fairing, or that are behind that shroud. Hitting that with the C2 so we start to see the fairing shape pop off the page a little bit. Right? We're starting to see how these things relate to each other. And now I'm coming in with the C4 and right behind the fork and behind that fairing, starting to push that back so we really start to see the depth that we have going on here. And right, showing that shadow underneath that pseudo tank that's completely empty, right? But that undersurface we want to hit with a darker value so that we know that it's turned away from the light. And hitting the wheels with that C4 and starting to set the front fender off of the tire. Right. That section underneath the rear seat that's open, we're hitting that with the C4 because it's almost completely tucked in shadow. It's covered by another surface. Okay, now I come in with the fine point and start to detail things out just a little bit more. So the nice thing with the Copic markers is you've got a fine point on one side so you can get a bit more detailed, do some chiseling if you will, or some finishing detail. And then on the other side, actually it makes more sense that you chisel on the other side because it's a chiseled point. Okay, fair enough. But you've got a nice fine tip on one side and you have a chisel point on the other where you can block things in a little bit faster and hide some of your working marks. So here I'm trying to work pretty quickly while the inks are wet to get a nice blend between the C2s, the C4s, and the C6. Right, so now I've got the C6 and I'm starting to, again, punch out some of those shadow areas or the darker areas of the motorcycle. And that's usually my process. I'll go from the lightest and I build up to the darkest just in layers. And anything that's turned away from the light source will get that C6 treatment. But we're creating a little bit of a vignette, right? So as I get towards the rear of the motorcycle, I don't use the C6. I mean, here I am, I think I'm back with the C2, just giving it a little bit more detail, but I'm not going to go super dark in value towards the rear of the bike. And by not doing that, we get a nice high contrast area towards the front of the bike, which in a front 3/4 view is ostensibly the closest part of the motorcycle, the part that might draw our attention the most, at least in the sketch. So by increasing the contrast in that section, it helps to create a hierarchy of, visual hierarchy of where you're supposed to start and where you're supposed to end. Right, so we want to start with the front of the bike. That's where the key emphasis is. And then we'll do the same thing on the rear 3/4, right? We'll keep the contrast at the rear and then fade away towards the front because we're trying to show the detail and the design of the rear section at that point. But here we are in the front 3/4, and now that I've laid in the C6, I'm coming back in with the Prismacolor and cleaning the lines up as a first step, right? Going over the line work because sometimes the markers will bleed a little bit, especially in this particular kind of a paper. It's just a regular printer paper. I'm not using a marker paper that contains the ink in a nice and with a consistent way. So we get a lot of bleeding with this type of paper. So I'll come back in with the Prisma, tighten the lines up so that we are getting a clean read for all of the details. And then what's nice here also with the Prisma and this particular technique versus the pen technique that you've seen or may have seen in some previous sketches is that we can build up some more subtlety with the Prismacolor. Meaning, we can add a little bit of shading to help to communicate some softer transitions. And then I can push certain areas a little bit farther into a darker range than I did with the C6, and it starts to give the overall sketch just a little bit more punch. But if you were to do that with a gel pen, it would just go straight to black or blue if you're using a blue gel, and you don't have any way to really build that subtlety up because it's not a very subtle media, it's very bold. Prismacolors, on the other hand, allow for that subtlety, right? So I was able to push back certain elements around in the shadow areas to get a darker contrast or a higher contrasting read. And at this point, I'm basically done. I'm saying, okay, I think this is good for now. We have an idea of what's going on. It seems pretty clean. And then I'll just add my directional arrows to give it some technical, a little bit of a technical feel. And I'm just gonna finish punching out a couple of elements. And that's about it. Listen, if you haven't already, if you're still here, like, subscribe. I've got links to many of the tools that I use in the description below. And take care. We'll see you later.